Now, this is lesson 2 of the series that we call Introduction to Literature. So, if you missed part 1 and you'd like to get some more information about previous lessons, please join the study group. So, literature. Literature is fictional writing. And we will be reviewing, from the last lesson, we will be reviewing literary forms, just give you a formal definition of what literature means and in what forms they take in popular fictional genres, just like we did in the previous lesson. Then we will be considering the benefits of reading great works of fiction, great works of literature. After that, we will be learning about literary devices, the difference between literary elements and literary techniques. Specifically, the literary techniques that we will be learning today. There's a whole lot of them, and we'll be looking at imagery, metaphors, similes, symbolism, and hyperbole. If you join the study group, I will upload a worksheet momentarily for you guys to follow along. Sorry we're behind schedule. So that will be, let's see here. Yeah, it's not. Our software needs to be cleaned up a little bit. But coming into the work group, study work group, that most of you are already a part of, we have this worksheet that includes 24 vocabulary terms that we will be defining in this lesson. Is it ready yet? Yes, it is. Okay. So this is what it is. Okay. These are the terms we would like to cover today. Abstraction, dialogue, element, figurative, hyperbole, idiom, imagery, imagination, inference, interpret, irony, literal, metaphor, perception, personification, rhetoric, sense, simile, symbol, and technique. Yeah, so maybe some of you who may have been business English majors, maybe you briefly touched on some of these things. If you are venturing into improving your English vocabulary through reading works of fiction, learning about literary criticism and how to appreciate a work of literature through understanding sort of the tools, the techniques that authors use in their writing, can make the experience of reading fictional work far more enjoyable. I think when we read stories, we're basically focusing on getting a handle on who the characters are and how the plot is progressing, maybe predicting a little bit what may happen in the story, and we're trying to keep ourselves amused and entertained. But when we're looking at historical works, reading works from several hundred years ago, where readers and audiences did not have the same set of expectations when it came to reading a work of fiction, it's hard for us as modern day readers to have the same kind of excitement or appreciation for an older piece of literature. Anyway, so we can appreciate great historical works when we understand some of the technical aspects of the writing. In other words, the writer is using techniques to convey the message, convey the meaning, help you to make a conclusion without maybe saying it explicitly, right? Maybe the writer is trying to teach a concept or present an idea that is not readily accepted by mainstream society. The writer has some sort of idea to reform how society organizes itself, or wants to introduce some kind of new idea about, what it means to be a human, right? These are kind of questions that writers need to consider, or often do consider in their art. So an abstraction. What is an abstraction? It's another word for an idea or a concept. And you could say that through the course of events in a story, one of the characters in the story has a kind of a realization about, the meaning of their life, or experiences a new depth of, a new understanding of themselves, whatever. So the reader can appreciate and feel the emotions of the character and appreciate the growth that the character has gone through. Anyway, the writer is trying to take experiences from his or her own life and put it into a story, not like an autobiography, a story of their personal history, but a fictional story. And they want to include these types of concepts, messages, ideas. So this is kind of what abstraction is. And of course, myth and old legends, really old stories, have what they call it's a condensation of a longer story, stories that are sort of condensed into their most basic structure, like a long epic tale told over hundreds and hundreds of years, gets refined with each telling till it comes to being a myth, being a very old story. And within a short story, take some short story out of a Bible, from any kind of religion, maybe the Bhagavad Gita, which is like the Indian Bible, or the Judeo-Christian Bibles. These contain old stories that are even older than the time they were written. And why are these stories told generation after generation after generation? It's not that they're particularly interesting stories, but when you consider some of the lessons contained in the story, why the characters do what they do, and what happens to them, and what happens as a result, the consequences of that. You could say that this is the story is an abstraction of something larger having to do with human psychology, basically. Anyway, dialogue. Dialogue is what we use to talk about how characters converse with each other, and the story moves forward that way. An element is like the most basic feature. You can't really remove it. So the element of a story is the character and the setting and the plot. What is figurative? Figurative and literal. Literal speech is where you say exactly what you mean. Figurative speech is where you're making an example of something to make a point, basically. We'll get into that tonight. Idiom, hyperbole. Hyperbole is another one of those literary techniques. It's kind of like a metaphor. It's an exaggeration. We're going to get into that. So I want you to pay attention to these terms. I've uploaded it to the study group, and you can see for yourself here. These are the kinds of terms that we want to be able to define. I know it's quite advanced, maybe not practical for most of you, but this is an introduction to literature, and if we do take this course further on and actually look at works of fiction, actually we will be looking at writers and their fictional work. If we do look at examples of some of their more famous works, like some excerpts or something like that, we can actually look at what an example of a hyperbole is, or an example of imagery and metaphor and all of these other things, right? This will improve you As a writer, this is very useful in speech writing, especially like making a public presentation. We use these rhetorical techniques, right? Rhetorical techniques. You can see that's a word there, rhetoric too. Rhetorical techniques. These are tactics that we've sort of crafted over hundreds of years in writing to make writing more emotional and more memorable, basically. That's why some of these great works of fiction are like so memorable. Anyway, moving on. Imagery. To think of an image, a mental image, right? Imagination. Your imagination is what you can see within your mind, basically. An inference. This is coming to a conclusion based on some knowledge, but you don't have a complete picture. So we often draw inferences from how a person may be feeling based on how they look, like, their facial expressions. Maybe they don't tell you how they're feeling, but based on their behavior, we can make an inference as to how they're feeling, and we can look at their patterns of behavior and make an inference as to why they're feeling upset or something like that, right? So we're able to come to conclusions without actually being told verbally what is true. We can make inferences through observation. To interpret, again, like to infer, and is also to interpret. So everybody's interpretation is unique. We can all watch a film, read a story, listen to a piece of music, and come up with our own idea, our own opinion, our own interpretation. And writers have to try to use a combination of these literary techniques to help readers arrive at the correct interpretation. Not just the superficial, but the one that is a little bit more deep, let's say. Irony. I don't really have much to talk about with respect to irony tonight. We'll focus on that a little bit more, but irony is what is funny. Literal. Metaphor, we'll talk about that. Hopefully you know some of these terms, right? A metaphor is a comparison between something that is real, like a person, a thing, and something imaginary is what a metaphor is. Perception. Again, the writer can create a perception in the reader's imagination, in the reader's mind, through the use of these different types of techniques. Personification, a person. We instinctively impose our subjective or project. We project our own subjective worldview and emotions on objects, whether they be other people and things, forces of nature, right? So we could say, like when we look at a painting or something like that, and we say, "What a beautiful work of art." It's a painting of like some flowers, a garden or something like that, right? And all of these feelings that come about as a result of looking at this painting, you are basically projecting your emotions onto that painting, or the painter who painted that was trying to project some kind of feeling into that through the use of color and lighting and so on. Writers do the same thing. Everybody does that. Everybody projects their own feelings and opinions onto the world around them. And one of the benefits of reading a variety of books means that we get a more well measured worldview, perception, because we're taking in the perceptions of other people. Okay, sense. We have the five senses: sight, hearing, smell, and touch. Simile is like a metaphor. We'll definitely cover that. Symbol, we'll cover that. Okay, so please do please do follow along with this worksheet. Hopefully by the end of the lesson, you'll have a better sense of what these words mean and why they're important. Okay? What is the definition of literature? Literature can mean any form of written work, for example, news, journalism, an academic or personal essay, and poetry, but literature is more specifically defined as imaginative and fictional writing. So literature comes in these three forms. Prose, which is in the form of novella or novel. Poetry, following the structural rules of verse and meter or rhyme. Short, structured, usually following a pattern, sometimes not. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about poetry tonight. And there was drama. Drama is the third one. Now these are the genres: fantasy, science fiction, horror, mystery, romance, and classical or canonical literature. Oops. Classical canonical literature. So what, let's watch this video here. What are the benefits of reading great works, and how are some authors put into the category of literary canon, while others aren't? Hopefully this video can explain that.
Books are the best of things, well used. Abused, among the worst. What is the right use? They are for nothing but to inspire. Of the many pastimes that occupy us, reading books is not one that ranks high on the list for many people. We live in a culture that prefers the glow of the screen to black ink on paper. And while part of the reason for this lies in the engrossing nature of modern technology, another reason is the ignorance many have regarding the benefits of reading. For books, especially the great ones, are not simply a form of entertainment. They are the source of what the poet Matthew Arnold called the best that has been known and thought in the world, and therefore are one of the greatest tools at our disposal to inspire us to live more fully. For all who feel trapped in an endless repetition of drudgery, reading the great books is an effective means of escape. Or as the author Mark Edmondson wrote, "We all get socialized once by our parents and teachers, ministers and priests. Reading great books is about getting a second chance. It's not about being born again, but about growing up a second time. This time around as your own educator and guide, Virgil to yourself." Many people lament over a lack of good role models and blame their problems on never having been taught how to deal with life's difficulties. But the great books can help mitigate such deficiencies. Biographies offer us access to role models who exceed anyone we are likely to meet in real life. The great works of fiction depict the human condition and ways to navigate it in a way unsurpassed by any other medium, while non-fiction books provide us with access to the ideas and worldviews of some of the greatest minds in history. Especially when life grows stale, it is to the great books we should turn to discover new ways of existing in the world. Or as Edmondson further explains, the test of a book lies in its power to map or transform a life. The question we would ultimately ask of any work of art is this: can you live it? If you cannot, it may still command considerable interest. The work may charm, it may divert. It may teach us something about the larger world, it may refine a point. But if it cannot help some of us to imagine a life, or unfold one already latent within, then it is not a major work. Books should be called major and become canonical when over time they provide existing individuals with live options that will help them change for the better. But along with providing us with ways to improve our life, the great books can also aid us in a process of self-discovery. The importance of self-knowledge in a life well lived has long been known, but it is notoriously difficult to attain. For along with our powers of self-deception, We often lack the words to describe and express the subtle and more profound contents of our mind. The great works of fiction can help remedy this situation, as the authors of these works are some of the most astute observers of human nature. Through their characters, they depict depths of the human soul few are able to disclose, and thus, their words can be used to unravel the mysteries of our own mind. We need to learn not simply to read books, wrote Edmondson, but to allow ourselves to be read by them. Or as the 20th century French author Marcel Proust explained, "It would be inaccurate to say that of those who would read my book as my readers, for it seemed to me that they would not be my readers, but readers of their own selves." Until recently, reading the great books of history for the purpose of self-improvement was the spirit which informed the humanities in universities across the West. But today an increasing number of humanities professors have abandoned this spirit. Rather than reviving the ideas of the great books and offering them to students as potentially better ways to live, many professors engage in what Soren Kierkegaard called a tragic misuse of scholarship. They teach their students to historicize and criticize the great books, and explain them away as irrelevant relics of the past. The great books are interesting, many modern professors believe, only insofar as they serve as examples of the so-called backwards social and political climate of the times in which they were produced. We will not have a real humanistic education, wrote Edmondson, until professors and their students can give up the narcissistic illusion that through something called theory or criticism, they can stand above Milton, Shakespeare, and Dante. This critical historical stance is breeding what the philosopher James Edwards called normal nihilists, that is, students who are masters in critical thinking for its own sake, specialists in tearing down all ideas and claims to beauty, truth, and knowledge. It is easy to be brilliant, wrote Goethe, when you don't believe in anything. Critical thinking is valuable when used to evaluate possible interpretations of events or phenomena before settling on any specific belief. But critical thinking for its own sake can lead one down a dangerous path. For if you only know how to destroy, but not how to build up your own convictions, then you will be left with no standards, ideals, and values to judge your actions and guide you towards higher possibilities. In such a situation, life will become a nullity, a meaningless void between two eternities of darkness, lived in slavish devotion to pleasure, or the single-minded pursuit of money or power. Or as Edmondson put it, so long as the humanities continue to churn out highly critical minds who believe in nothing, what you're likely to get are more and more two-dimensional men and women. These will be people who live for easy pleasure, who think of money first, then second, and third, who hug the status quo. They will be people so pleased with themselves, when they're not in despair at the general pointlessness of their lives, that they cannot imagine that humanity could do better. Fortunately, we can engage in our own personal study of the great works of history without subjecting ourselves to the corrupting influence of the modern university. And if we decide to be one of the few to make reading great books a priority, what we are likely to discover is that as we become more fixated on the wisdom contained in them, the pull of technology and the white noise of the culture around us will lose its grip on our mind. For as Edmondson explains, people who have taught themselves how to live, what to be, what to do, from reading great works, will not be overly susceptible to the culture industry's latest wares. They'll be able to sample them or turn completely away. They'll have better things on their minds.
Okay, quite a bit to unpack there. What are the benefits of reading great books? Okay, so the first thing he said, or the first argument, is that they inspire us to live more fully. Again, we are, as human beings, creatures of habit. As social creatures, we are always seeking to kind of conform to the group, right? And if we are living in a kind of a time where we are living in a time where sort of culture, there's a culture war happening. There's always been a culture war happening, but the culture war that is happening right now, the dominant group is imposing its ideas on the society, And these ideas are things like consume and obey, and go, pursue after money and power and material success, basically. So, um, that's just basic survival. But we as human beings, also have this artistic drive in us to um, make, to evolve and to progress, and to be greater than what we think we can be, right? Like people impose their beliefs on how great we can be. So you have to be able to think differently, or think outside of what society and what culture wants you to think, right? This is what these writers, these great writers, try to try to inspire in their fiction. They're the best source of wisdom. Again, like you can read the greatest minds from every generation, all the way back to the beginning of recorded history. And in future lessons, we'll look at who some of those great historical figures were. They allow us to educate ourselves, so we can learn, not just through fiction. We can learn anything. Right? We can learn anything through books. Fictional characters and biographies give us positive role models. They entertain and provide a means of escape. Self-discovery. Great authors can help us to articulate and express our hidden feelings and thoughts. So again, like a writer may spend their entire lives. They may spend like 20 years working on a book, revising and adding and um, you know, amending, right? Before finally publishing. Sometimes the writer's best known work isn't really accepted until long after that writer has passed on. So the thoughts of the writer, like a writer puts their entire life's work into their into their book, and when you read one of these, you're getting a shortcut, basically. A writer spends a lot of time and emotional effort on making a kind of a realization about the source of unhappiness and anxiety, or um, um, self-destructive behavior, let's say. We're all prone to that. We're all susceptible to making mistakes, and um, indulging in negative feeling or negative patterns of behavior, basically, because if society doesn't teach us not to, then we'll just go ahead and do that, right? And society at large does permit, a lot of self-destructive behavior. So again, it's the writers that are going against the grain and helping us to try to correct our path, not going where society wants us to go, but go where like we as like higher spiritual beings are meant to go, basically. So they can help us to articulate and express our hidden feelings and thoughts that we weren't really aware. Like maybe we're subconsciously aware at some deep level. A writer can articulate that, and then it can kind of create an epiphany, an aha moment for the reader to unleash potential or transform negative beliefs. It can be a form of therapy. We can learn from historical people and events to put current affairs into perspective, as human history continually repeats itself. We can be challenged to become more mature and patient and less susceptible to manipulation by modern day interest groups and mass media. Okay, so I have to move um, over to this section here. Oh, okay, so everything came up out of order. Um, Yeah, everything's totally out of order here. So now we're talking about what are the literary devices. Literary devices are categorized as literary elements and literary techniques. Literary elements we covered last week. Literary devices refer to, or not last week, 4 weeks ago. Literary devices refer to artistic structures used by writers to convey their message to readers. They can help readers to enjoy, interpret, and analyze their literary work. Again, like a great writer learns how to write from reading other great writers, basically. And there are college programs and entire professions dedicated to critiquing and analyzing works of literature. So you can read the work of literature, and then you can read the literary criticism as well to learn more about the writer and what the book has to offer. Anyway, so they add beauty and depth of meaning. These literary devices add beauty and depth of meaning. They challenge and stimulate the reader's imagination, understanding, and emotional responses. They can be treated as either literary elements or literary techniques. So we talked about the elements of the story in Introduction to Literature, Part 1, right? And this is the map. Literary elements are those aspects that are fundamental to literary works. For example, plot, setting, narrative structure, characters, themes, and morals. What is the plot? The sequence of events, beginning with exposition, helping the reader to understand, who's who and where the story takes place. And then there's a trigger moment, some kind of conflict, rising action, climax. Okay? The setting. Where does the story take place and when? The narrator. So the main character might be talking about, the narrator might be talking about the main character and have nothing to do with the story. The narrator may be the main character. The narrator is the person who tells the story or the manner in which the story is told. The characters. The protagonist and antagonist. The main character's good and bad. The dialogue, how the story is carried forward through the conversations that the characters have with each other. The conflict. So the story doesn't end until the conflict is finally resolved, right? The conflict and the tension and the rising action is always building. The conflict is becoming more and more serious. And the story, reaches its resolution when the conflict cannot be escalated any further, basically. And then there's the tone or the theme or the moral, right? So the why was the story told in the first place? What was the purpose of telling the story? What is the narrator what is the main underlying message that the narrator wants the reader to understand? Why is the story significant? The central idea or concept of the story. Okay, so those are the literary elements. Now we want to look at the literary techniques. Now we can go to this one here. Yeah, literary techniques. Sorry, things came out a little bit chaotic, but I can manage it. Okay, literary techniques. They are structures in the text that the writers employ to assist the readers to better understand and appreciate the literary work. So hopefully you've heard about some of these most fundamental ones. Figurative language. Now this is useful as well for the intermediate students that are grappling with idioms and metaphors and figures of speech. It's kind of an interesting topic. And it's interesting, I suppose, because there are examples everywhere, and we're not even really conscious of using them. And once you start to identify one, you can begin to recognize them everywhere, right? So, figurative language. Um, um, Ideas that are complex or abstract, not readily explainable, can be effectively conveyed through comparisons like metaphors and similes. Again, we enjoy jokes, we enjoy um, music, we enjoy a little bit of wordplay when we're socializing with our friends. The people that are considered to be like interesting in conversation are those that can get us to think for ourselves um, through storytelling and through making interesting comparisons or analogies. And those people that we consider to be sort of insightful or wise, those people that have a depth of character, they've experienced a lot, they're well educated and articulate. Those are the people that can employ, rhetorical techniques, figurative language, um, to make a person think, to provoke somebody to think. Okay, so the writer can indirectly get at a meaning through implication or inference. Like people are easily bored, especially when we're speaking in just basic literal language. When we can get creative, the conversation and the presentation can become a lot more interesting for audiences. So the writer can get at the meaning through implication or inference through the use of irony or sarcasm or hyperbole, um, exaggerating, understating, or saying the opposite of the intended message. So rhetorical devices use figures of speech such as metaphors that go beyond literal meaning to evoke the reader's imagination, as well as patterns of words to appeal to the reader's senses, such as rhyming words. Okay? Again, people like to imagine for themselves. So writers and presenters and storytellers can get the audience to imagine and experience for themselves the events of the story rather than just simply outlining the sequence of events. Help the person kind of experience what it is like to be amidst the events taking place. So imagery is probably the easiest literary technique or rhetorical device that anybody can use. So we create visual representations of actions, objects, and ideas in our mind in a way that they appeal to our physical senses. So show, don't tell. Use descriptive language to describe what the scene looked like, what sounds were there. So the function of imagery in literature is to generate a vibrant and graphic presentation of a scene that appeals to as many of the reader's senses as possible. It aids the reader's imagination. Okay? Here are some examples of how imagery is used in writing, right? The room was dark and gloomy. Dark and gloomy are the visual words. And these words have connotations too, emotional connotations. The beautiful starry night beckoned him to wonder in awe. It's a beautiful starry night. The fragrant field of colorful flowers filled her with joy. The distant-sounding drums beat louder and more menacing sounding as they approached nearer. The cold wind bit painfully. So we can call that elaboration. If you're telling a story, you have your plot outline, and then you can expand on. You can tell the story through scenes, right? Think of a film or a play or a book as a collection of scenes, a sequence of scenes. and the plot is what sort of events um, go through each of these scenes. But the plot is one thing. Um, people appreciate an interesting, complex plot, but bad stories or bad movies usually aren't successful because there's too much plot. They're trying to keep the audiences interested by introducing new scenes all the time. But those scenes are very short and sort of forgettable, right? So a story can be more interesting if the scenery is rich and the director or the writer or the storyteller takes enough time and effort to allow the reader to or audience to sort of appreciate and experience what the setting is like and how the character is feeling. Um, Basically, just have an experience. Personification. Um, Non-human objects are portrayed in such a way that we feel that they have the ability to act like human beings. So we project onto our pets all kinds of personality traits and feelings that the pet may or may not actually have. We project that onto the pet. We have our like our beloved personal possessions, a thing that you own that is symbolic and has a lot of sentimental value to you because it was given to you by somebody, or it helps you to remember a certain time in your life, right? That's personification. So we see this. This is a typical, fundamental example of personification. Heaven looked down upon them mercifully, right? Um, okay, simile, metaphor, and symbolism. A metaphor is a figure of speech that makes an implicit, implied, or hidden comparison between two things that are unrelated but which share common characteristics. In other words, a resemblance of two contradictory or different objects is made based on a single or some common characteristics. So, simile and metaphor both compare two distinct objects and draw the similarity between them. I have some examples here. Symbolism. The use of symbols signify ideas and qualities, giving them symbolic meanings that are different from the literal sense. Again, it's quite instinctive for us to project onto things that we see, like inanimate symbols, deep emotional meaning. Symbolism can take different forms. It generally takes, well, let's look at some examples of symbols here. So, the symbol of the chain. They can shift in meaning, right? A positive connotation or positive, like, symbolic meaning of a chain could be union and strength and friendship. The negative meaning could be imprisonment, confinement. So symbols give the writer freedom to add more levels of meaning. Symbolism evokes in the reader's interest an insight into what the writer is thinking. Symbolism in literature evokes interest in the readers as they find an opportunity to get an insight into the writer's mind on how he views the world and how he thinks of common objects as having broader implications. Okay, I have to go back to the next part here. So let's look at some examples of symbols and also idioms. So an idiom is a metaphor, a symbol, personification, hyperbole, all in one. The term idiom refers to a set of expression or phrase comprising of two or more words, so it's a figure of speech, not intended to be interpreted literally. So what are the examples? Okay. The fox. The fox is a predatory canine animal. They're not terribly dangerous to us as, people. As we sort of evolved through history, we probably had some relationship with them. Like we have a relationship with dogs, right? Foxes are relatives of dogs. But we never really came to like the fox very much. Because the fox is a thief. We might have had possibly young children or domesticated animals, and the fox would take, take those. So the fox is a symbol of thief. Not particularly dangerous, but clever and untrustworthy. So we attribute that set of characteristics to people. Saying he's an old fox and very cunning, or the fox is cunning, right? That's personification onto a fox. And then making a metaphor, comparing a person who is cunning, untrustworthy, to a fox. So personification and metaphor, applying human traits to an animal, and then comparing a human to a personified animal. All these layers of abstraction happening in that simple sentence there. Foxes are perceived as clever hunters, friendly in some ways, but ultimately untrustworthy. And there are lots of fables, lots of stories that use foxes as characters, children's stories that use foxes as characters, to teach children maybe these types of character qualities, how to watch out for predatory people maybe. The black sheep is a very cliche example. I was always the black sheep in the family. I could never get along with the rest of them. Meaning to be different from the rest of the herd. Sheep are herd animals. They like to gather together and move as one herd. And, there's sort of an evolutionary purpose behind that. They can protect themselves from predators as moving as one large herd. And a black sheep stands out. That makes the black sheep a little bit more susceptible or vulnerable to predation. Okay, so the black sheep is a bit of an outsider, an outcast. Maybe the black sheep is not wanted, is not readily accepted in the herd because it makes the herd more perceptible to predators, possibly. The dove is a symbol of peace, and to call somebody gentle as a dove means having no untrustworthy intentions. The eagle, on the other hand, is a bird of prey, a hunter, and a symbol of strength and dominance. And there's a song that uses the line, "I want to fly like an eagle," meaning freedom and strength. The owl. The owl is a nocturnal bird. It sleeps in the day and hunts at night. It's very perceptive, and it can see in the dark very well. And presumably because it spends a lot of its time perched on a tree, just watching with these big eyes, we personify the owl as being wise and insightful. And there's the idiom of a night owl. Calling somebody a night owl is somebody who is largely nocturnal, somebody who likes to stay up very late, often alone, reading or doing whatever. A night owl, somebody who is nocturnal and a bit of a loner. We might also call somebody a lone wolf, not part of the rest of the pack. The lion is the king of the jungle, a savage hunter. Rose is a symbol of romance and matrimony. Red is a symbol of strong emotion. And then again, there's this nice line from a song. I compare you to a kiss from a rose on the gray. It makes no sense at all. But there's imagery there, right? The rose is red and the world is gray. So a person, like a woman who comes into a man's life, is like a rose in the gray, a rose on the gray, gives color to the gray world, the gray reality, basically. A song by Seal, Kiss from a Rose. It's a super successful song. Using that simple idiom or a simple metaphor. Butterflies, a symbol, excuse me. Yeah, rose is a symbol. Butterfly is a symbol. So butterflies are unique and beautiful, somewhat rare and associated with transformation and youth and rebirth. Like the butterfly spends most of its life as a caterpillar and goes into a cocoon. I'm not sure how long the butterfly actually lives for, but it's a short life, right? The butterfly's life is short-lived, and therefore the butterfly is like a symbol of a short, beautiful existence, basically. A social butterfly. It's associated with youth and being a rare, unique, beautiful creature. Another idiom, every dark cloud has its silver lining. So a dark cloud is a threat, it implies a rainstorm. But the sunlight that lies behind the cloud is the sort of the positive outcome. So there's an expression, an idiom, every dark cloud has a silver lining. Look beyond the dark challenge in front of you and have faith that there is sunlight behind it, a silver lining. These aren't particularly deep metaphors. They're very, very simple, very common ones, right? And we could look at examples almost endlessly. Here we have the cards as a source of metaphor. So to have an ace up your sleeve is to have a secret weapon, or a plan B, basically. If things go wrong, you can pull out the ace and play it in the game. If you play your cards right, you can get the promotion. These are figures of speech or idioms. I was dealt a bad hand in life. Luck wasn't in the cards for me. So the metaphor of cards and social situations in life and how to play to win at the game of cards is compared to how to win at life. Cards are a game of chance, strategy, and psychological manipulation. To win at the game of cards is partly chance, and then strategy, and in some types of games, psychological manipulation. So achieving aims in everyday social situations can be compared to the game of cards. And lastly, we have hyperbole. Okay, so we're looking at just symbolism, imagery, metaphor, idioms for tonight's literary devices, basically. These all have some commonality here. Hyperbole is overcasting or overstating, exaggerating. A figure of speech that involves an exaggeration of ideas for the sake of emphasis. We use hyperbole in daily conversation to create amusing effect, or emphasize the meaning. And in literature, it can also help develop contrast. In other words, maybe a character overstates something and the situation is presented normally. This creates a contrast, and this is where the writer is trying to draw the reader's attention to the disparity between what is said and what actually is, to maybe show that the character is feeling strong emotion or is under emotional distress or something like that. Okay? The writer doesn't always want to give away the reader's psychology, so they sometimes use dialogue and these literary techniques to help the reader notice something. Anyway, so I have a million issues to look after, is something we always say, right? I have to work so hard at my job. I feel like I'm carrying a boulder up a mountain. Just exaggeration. She took my heart and shattered it into a million tiny pieces, like a heart, glass, shattered. Is the metaphor. Like the heart is a fragile, like the glass is a fragile material, and the heart is the symbol of like having a relationship or a union with another person. To be heartbroken is to have that separation, basically. So again, there's a lot of symbolism in these simple little statements that we throw around all the time. It's amazing that we can instinctively interpret them. He was often a raging bear when he hadn't had his morning coffee for breakfast. And lastly, the man of steel, faster than a speeding bullet. Okay? So, there you go. I would invite you to watch part 1. I would invite you to join the study group if you're not part of the study group, where you can get the links to previous past lessons and the worksheets. Okay? So this is part of the ongoing literature series. Next week we will be looking at geography, American cities, followed by modern science or branches of science, followed by business English, where we'll be looking at a survey of different types of industries, and then in 1 month's time, on the second week of the month of August, we'll be coming back to this literature series. If you have any questions, again, please do reach out to me. And so in the next lesson, on the next literature lesson, we will be looking at more examples of literary devices, literary techniques, like how writers can use patterns of words to create a more rich, sensual, stimulating effect, poetry especially. And we'll start to look at some of the great writers and their works as well.